I'm- I'll start again because the recording just began. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Lucia Rahilly. I'm the editorial director at McKinsey and Company, and I'm your host for this series of live webinars sponsored by the Global Thought Leadership Institute at APQC. Quick note before we start, this series is designed to give you the opportunity to engage with some of the most seasoned practitioners in the field of thought leadership today. We hold them on a monthly cadence, and you can see our roster by following the GTLI on LinkedIn or by visiting our fancy new website at gtli.org. You can also take a look at past webinars on our YouTube channel by searching for at GTLI-APQC. We would really love for this session to be as interactive as possible. We want to make these genuinely audience back and useful. So we invite you to please send along your questions using the Zoom chat functionality, and I will do my best to field as many of them as possible. Today, Liz Bolshaw, the amazing Liz Bolshaw, Global Content Strategist and Editorial Lead for Insights at EY. Liz is also my fellow advisory board member on the GTLI. And today she joins us to talk through the results of a piece of flagship research the GTLI published several months ago on thought leadership and dun, 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 AI, specifically the way AI is transforming how thought leadership is created and discovered, and also vitally, the trust that our audiences place in research-driven content in what promises to be an increasingly slop-saturated environment. Liz, welcome. Great to see you as always, and thanks for being together with us today.
So much, Lucia. It's great. And I hope this will be an interesting session. After it, I would just urge everybody to go onto the website where you can download the full report, because what we're going to be looking at today is just some highlights and really using it, I think, to have a broader discussion about how AI is changing the way that we produce thought leadership, but also examining how our audiences, our clients are not only using it, but thinking about AI. And there's some really interesting things that came out of this research that I don't think any of us quite expected. So I hope that everybody here will find that an interesting walk through.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a look. Um, Liz, let's start with a little bit of context. When it comes to AI, it feels like we're often toggling between the good, the bad, and the ugly, or the promise and peril, using the framing of our GTLI report. I alluded to slop a moment ago, which is on the tip of every thought leadership producer's tongue this summer. What worries you most about AI generated slop?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it has created an absolute tsunami of content online. So I think I'm right in saying it. December 2024, so quite a while ago now, computer generated, AI generated content overtook human generated content online. So, in terms of sheer finding a way around a universe of content, slop is everywhere. It was the word of the year for The Economist and for Merriam-Webster last year. And of course, now we're getting nuances of slop. So work slop, as everybody's talking about, is, when you're encouraged to use AI at work and you don't really particularly find it useful, but you nevertheless have to show that you're using it. And I have no doubt that we'll have more and more variations of the word slop. So for me, there are two things about this. One, it goes to credibility. How do you, as a serious thought leadership producer, identify what you're doing as significantly and systematically different from what other stuff is out there? And the other thing is discoverability. How do we make sure that those best pieces, those really transformative pieces of research, are in some way distinguished from a sea of other stuff?
Mhm.
So I think those are, to me, the two things that we need to think about.
Mhm. Mhm. You know, it's interesting because it feels like we're quite early in the process of studying what productive use of AI means, both in the sense of our own neuroscience, the neuroscience of our individual brains when AI can be used as a substitute for effort, and also in terms of our collective knowledge. Darren Asimoglu from MIT just published a few months ago. I don't know if you've read this, a really interesting report on the potential for agentic AI to improve immediate, highly personalized decision making, but simultaneously to erode like the richness and quality and depth of our collective store of knowledge. So, how do you think about partnering with AI? What's the best way of partnering with AI and not as a substitute?
I think actually the next slide is a good one. Maybe we could go to the next one just to look at this. So this was a campaign that Anthropic launched. This is West Village in Manhattan. I think it was October last year. And what they did was they did this pop-up, which was ironically, you had to leave your phones and your digital devices at the door. They called it a zero slop zone, and it was entirely devoted to analog reading. So there were no digital options here. And I think it raised, I mean, it was a fun thing to do, but I think it raised a really interesting question, which is, and we're seeing it a lot actually at the moment in the sort of backlash against AI, which is the idea that, there's kind of general cognitive atrophy, that, we're kind of stopping thinking and using our human thing because we can just do something really fast. And I think that's the most important thing is never to stop questioning, never to stop, in a way, interacting with whatever material it is. I mean, I think thought leadership is a contact sport, and we must never forget that. We have to engage with ideas, and we have to test those ideas against, the client experience that most of us working in the professional services era all have. So I think there's this constant interaction between what AI can do for us, which is absolutely awesome in so many respects. But you can't just kind of end it there, because I think if you end it there, you will never really be coming above that sea of sameness. I think it was a wonderful source expression in their latest report on quality rankings, which was that there is this sense of everybody being a little bit similar and the same. And the only way to stop that really is to be personally engaged. And I think that's what this wonderful Anthropic campaign was talking about.
Hmm. Agree. So this is a good segue, I think, to trust. We are already operating at something of a trust deficit, arguably, at least in the increasingly fact-free zone that is the United States. How does trust factor into the dynamics of content consumption?
I think if we go to the next slide, there are some interesting stats that will help us with this. Yeah, so Edelman Trust Barometer, obviously, something we all know and love. We can see how some of this is playing out. Some of this has to do with algorithms, which is, the first one, which is that we're increasingly operating in kind of cognitive silos because, we're only seeing something that the algorithm has already identified is likely to meet with our approval. And that's one of the problems with LLMs is they're so anxious to please that they get very quickly, Liz, we know you like this kind of a thing, so that's what we're going to give you. Whether it exists in the real world or not, don't worry about it. You've got something. So I think this idea of not really ever having your ideas challenged or ever trying to understand a really opposing point of view is a concern. It's a concern in academia, clearly, but I think it's also a concern for us in professional services. And I think insularity, employers are, have quite high trust scores. Always amazes me, but we have a real opportunity, and in a sense, we also have a responsibility, I think, to ensure that we are not inhabiting these tiny silos, and we challenge ourselves as well. I think that's very important. The Reuters pieces below this are looking at something slightly different, and the first one is talking about how AI overviews now are really replacing, SEO and search. So when we were talking earlier about discoverability, we can see that it's increasingly difficult to make sure that your piece of work that you've done hasn't just been kind of summarized and put into a quick fast food takeout, but unidentifiably what it was originally. And that is leading to credibility and misinformation issues. And we can see in that I think this is a wonderful site here, that more than half of the respondents to the Reuters Digital News Report worry that they can't really distinguish between fake and real news, and that rises very significantly in the US. So
Surprise.
misinformation, misinformation, hallucinations, fake news. I mean, it is all around us, and the real problem is when people just don't believe anything. And I think that's something that we will increasingly see, is people just say, well, it's all rubbish anyway, or it's all fake. So where does credibility really lie? How can we prove our credentials? How can we provide that sense of trust that is essential for people not only to read what we have to say, but also to kind of place some, actually act on it. And that's it's a big challenge, I think, for all of us for the future.
Yeah, huge. So, Liz, in the interest of tethering ourselves to credible research, tell us a little bit about the methodology for the survey that undergirded this report.
Sure. So I think we can go to the next slide.
Mhm.
Gives a visual of it, hopefully. Yeah. So we wanted to ask pretty similar, almost, in fact, identical questions of these two communities that come together. The first are CxOs. In this case, we asked 1,000 CxOs across 19 countries, 18 industries. So very broad brush. On the whole, focused on bigger companies, because those are the clients that most of us are working with. And we asked them very similar questions to a group of thought leadership producers. Now, 359 may not sound like a lot, but actually that represents a very long tail, because there are only really about 20, 25 major organizations who produce more than 90% of the thought leadership that we all consume. So when we're looking at the results, we had to kind of think very carefully between the respondents here that were often in very niche, quite small areas, and those of us who tend to be the bigger producers of thought leadership. So that's just a thought as we go through. But what we found was there were certain areas that we all agree on, and one or two that actually really divided these two communities. And I think that was one of the things we had a hypothesis and we wanted to test it. So the methodology was here. It was a typical double-blind survey, and completely anonymized. So we have no idea who was in it. But it was quite an interesting thing to do. Yeah. So
Well, okay. Yeah, well, so let's get into it. Let's get into the results. Let's turn to the research and to what the research revealed about what executive audiences want and think about thought leadership in an environment where content is so readily available and where knowledge is so much more easily not just accessed but synthesized than in the past. Does thought leadership still matter in the same way to executives? Does it still have value? I think that's the next slide.
yeah, I mean, I was amazed by this because, when you have huge supply, anybody who's done any economics knows, demand disappears. So we have huge supply. There's no question about it. The content volume available to people freely is greater than ever before in history. And yet here you can see that our executive audiences say They make better decisions as a result of reading thought leadership. They feel their organizations are better off because they apply the learning. And a whopping 4 in 5, which I don't quite believe, but it's there in the stats, 4 in 5 can actually ascribe quantitative value. In other words, they can put a dollar sign on what that reading that thought leadership has done for their organizations. So on the background of all that supply and volume and noise, executives are still looking for the signals. They're still desperately, I would say, seeking those clear, research-backed pieces of advice that we aim to do as a group, not just us in EY, obviously. So I thought that was interesting. It was a much higher percentage than I was expecting. Lucia, I don't know if that surprised you, but
It's pretty high. I mean,
validation.
quite high. Yes, you're right. I was relieved and pleased to see this, but I would say that these figures were a little bit higher than what I would have expected. Yeah. And there is a question, Liz, in the chat, or rather a comment that the signal to noise ratio is what's key and being that signal. So I think you just invoked that a bit, that this is what executives are telling us. They're looking for the signal amid all this sea of content. So hopefully not a sea of sameness, but amid the noise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's the idea that yes, there's a lot of supply, but it's not necessarily meeting the need. And I think that's where we need to be very careful and very considered about, are we just adding to the noise, or are we actually meeting a challenge that really our executives are looking to meet? And I think that's the important thing. And that's where the opportunity is for sure in the
Yeah,
future.
and it feels like that's always been the important thing, but within this tremendous deluge of content, it's more important than ever. There's a question here, Liz. Did you say that 25 organizations produce 90% of thought leadership? And would you be able to share that list? I don't know if that list is within the longer report.
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I think organizations like Source Global Research um, have done some of this. This isn't a new stat, but I think generally it's been accepted that it is about 25 major professional services organizations that produce over 90% of thought leadership. Yeah, I mean, those stats may shift a little bit. We know that there are increasingly corporates are developing their own content teams and producing their own material. We know that law firms, for example, for some time now have grown thought leadership teams and are certainly producing content. So, it's not very precise. I'm not trying to say it's exactly 25 or exactly 90%, but I think generally it is that kind of ratio. Yeah.
And speaking of Source, it looks like we have a quote from Source on the next slide.
Yeah. So this is the other I think the other underpinning factor about why executives can really still want thought leadership, and it's the operating environment being not just uncertain, which I think it has been for many years, to be honest, but predictably unreliable is a really interesting phrase. So that that is going to be unreliable. The things that you normally can rely on in terms of business strategy, in terms of looking forward to the next quarter, the next year, actually no longer exists because the world has become so volatile and everything is accelerating. It's not just that it's volatile, but it's that it's volatile in a very fast environment, and that's really, really hard to make good decisions in those kinds of things. And I think that's really why we see this resounding validation of thought leadership. It's against these backgrounds.
Yeah, it's more important than ever. And
Yeah.
next slide maybe illustrates that even further.
Just the good old, World Trade Uncertainty Index. This has had another spike since the conflict in the Middle East, unsurprisingly. So this takes it up to just over January last year. But we can see that, if you go back to January 2008, I think is the beginning of this graph, I mean, the uncertainty index is off the scale now. So that is also feeding in, I think, to what executives are looking for, why thought leadership has such a central place to play.
Okay, so I think we actually have a poll now. We've talked about executives valuing thought leadership at quite highly, and we're interested in your thoughts on what executives in your audiences most look to thought leadership for. I cannot vote. Liz, you and I cannot vote, sadly.
I know, it's a shame.
How we doing, Nikki? Do we have results? Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. So if we look here, Lucia, what we're seeing is the innovation gets the greatest share of the votes,
Yep.
um, but not massively more than operational improvements. So those are the kind of top two, and then Gen AI and digital are sort of, less popular. Shall we see what our
Yeah.
survey respondents said?
Yes,
We
let's.
did ask this question. So next slide. There we go. So here we asked about the extent to which an organization incorporates insights into these different areas. And as you can see, operational improvements was way, way down the list of priorities. And innovation was a very, very clear winner. So although our audience today had the right instincts that innovation was going to be important, actually, if you look at those two, you look at the difference between innovation and operational improvements is really, really substantial change. And it's interesting to us because we certainly, I think, would not have predicted that. And we do quite a lot of thought leadership that I think is focused on making, performance improvements, benchmarking, all those things we love. And yet, I think where executives are struggling is in that area of innovation. If you just think about AI, AI has transformed nudge improvements in processes, really for most big companies. But has it really put a rocket up innovation? Probably not yet. And that I think is the next big challenge. And I think is what everybody wants to see is how can we innovate faster? How can we innovate more effectively? How can we really be creative? How can AI help us do that? To gain market share and to gain sort of competitive advantage through being more innovative. And our thought leadership is something that our clients hope that we can somehow we can wave the magic wand over that big challenge.
It's interesting, Liz, because I was going to ask you when the survey was in the field and whether Gen AI might be so low because we were earlier on the adoption curve when responses were gathered. But I see that it's low in our, today's
Mm.
results as well. I don't know if it's because it's a sub of innovation, it's a sub of digital or AI and tech-enabled transformation. It's a sub, it's part, it's imbricated with all those categories, but I find that interesting.
We were in the field, I think, from memory, in the summer. So I think we were there for something like August and September. So I mean, Gen AI was,
Yeah,
already, a
yeah.
thing. I think you're right, though. I think Gen AI, it's a bit like the weather now, isn't it? I mean, it's just part of everything. It's not its own thing.
Right.
Um, so perhaps that's why. Um, and yeah, you could say, digital transformation, all of these things feed into each other.
Now, as a word person, Liz, an expert word person, would you agree that innovate faster is oxymoronic?
I don't think I would. I mean, I think it's possible to make fast leaps. And we've seen examples of that in you know, especially actually in kind of developing nations. I always love the example of mobile banking, born in Kenya
Yeah,
because there
yeah.
were huge numbers of
M-Pesa.
unbanked and
Yeah.
everybody had a mobile phone.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes you do get these leaps in innovation. Whether that's always the case, I mean, I'm not an innovation expert. I wish I was, but I think that it's. So I would say no, it's not an oxymoron. But I think you can't not do the hard work either. So I think you have to do the slow digging and the kind of working through. But sometimes you can just have, light bulb moment. And many companies do. I was reading a thing in the FT today about, I can't remember the name of the company, but the company that produces Pyrex, glass
Mhm.
oven-proof dishes,
Mhm.
is making a mint at the moment, producing kind of the outer bits of cabling for data centers. They also make the screens for your smartphone and other things like that. But it's these segues from they have absolutely knowledge of a particular manufacturing in a particular area, but then they adapt it to a completely new market and do that really effectively. And that to me is innovation.
Yeah, agree. Patricia Taft, you can take that up with
Calling,
Liz
that's right.
offline.
Somebody's
But
put in the chat calling.
yeah. Let's keep moving. Talk to us about the areas of biggest impact to areas of consumption here. Track areas of business impact, roughly speaking.
Here we get, more of a sort of smorgasbord of things that people are looking to, and specifically how ideas that they have found in thought leadership have contributed to their own transformation journeys. And, innovation again, is top of the list here, but you can see a bigger spread right through to employee engagement and, some of these other things. So I think here you could say, is it entirely logical that you've got operating cost pretty high, well over 58% here. And yet when we were talking about operational improvements, it was devalued. So I think there's some of this comes together, and but it just shows you the range of um, the range of topics that for executives they look to thought leadership to help them with. I think that's the main thing here.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room always, and that is quality. Everyone in this research-driven content racket has talked and talked and talked about quality and distinctiveness for as long as I've been in this business, at least as long as I can remember. Enter AI, there's now a new variable to consider, as we discussed earlier, vis-a-vis slop. Let's talk here about what the research said about quality. It's,
So this was really interesting, Lucia, because as you could probably imagine, um, both producers and consumers of thought leadership agree on the number one quality metric, which is the depth of insights and analysis is the number one from both sides. But as soon as you start going down this ranking of what really matters and what really plays into quality, the two groups diverge fairly quickly, and there are some interesting differences. So, first one I call out was actionability. So, for clients and for consumers of thought leadership, it's the number four most important thing they're looking for. How do they act? How do they actually act on the advice that's given? You can produce an interesting report, but actually, if it doesn't have clear actions, they can't actually. What do you do with it? That isn't useful. As producers, we don't really care much about actions, as you can see. We put it right down almost at the bottom. The other thing that I think is interesting to call out here is on the reverse is production quality, things like writing style, the beauty of your data visualizations, all of these things we spend very long hours trying to get right. Actually, our clients are not that bothered about it. In other words, the actual content matters much more than the how we show it. Um, and when it comes to the credibility of an individual author, again, something that I would say we as thought leadership producers think is really important to make sure that, our biggest stars are there authoring obviously authoring our thought leadership. Actually, this is increasingly not so important to our clients, as you can see. So as soon as you go from that number one, you can see these interesting divergences in terms of what really matters, what quality definitions matter to clients versus those of us who are creating it.
Liz, can I just follow on that credibility gap
Yeah,
there and be clear on it? Um, this is not about credibility of the material, obviously,
no,
right? It's what we mean there, that the publisher is not necessarily a legacy publisher of thought leadership. And if so, small players, should you be taking note? Credibility of source. This is your opportunity, right? To take share from McKinsey, EY, etc. Am I reading that correctly?
yeah, 100%. What it's really
Yeah.
saying, and I think this is also very much accelerating with AI.
Hmm.
If we think about it, it's increasingly people mind about the depth of insight. They don't really mind who's done it. That's less important. So I think there's some really interesting things, as you say, the old idea that you look to those big brands, if you like. That maybe we as big producers may be able less to rest on those sort of legacy brand, yes, we're the best, than was so in the past. And
Hmm.
as you say, small producers, niche producers have a real opportunity, I think.
And why do you think actionability matters less to producers? I mean, I know in our context, we've for decades had a few criteria for distinctiveness. One was novelty of perspective, one was validity of research, and one was usefulness to our audience. However, it's harder for us to get the examples and the cases and so forth that bring to life the usefulness of the insights. And so it's been a bit, sometimes that piece of it can feel a bit bolted on when you're reading thought leadership, but certainly it matters to us. What's your take on why actionability matters less to producers?
I think you're right, Lucia. I think all of us would say it matters. It's just how much it matters. So I
Yeah.
think what we're seeing is that for clients, the actionability of or the utility of what they're reading is vital. They haven't got lots of time, so they're not just sitting there reading a novel for fun. They
Right.
actually want to be able to take something away that will change the way they do their jobs. Whereas I think for producers, maybe we don't think it's as important as some other things.
Mhm.
Um, it's also harder. I mean, I would say,
Harder. Yeah.
you know, I look at, and I'm sure you do too, Lucia. I mean, I look at most of our competitors' thought leadership, I've spent quite a lot of time reading it. And I think we all struggle a little bit to provide actions that are really interesting. They're either very broad. I mean, they have all things like, you know, think about your digital strategy, or make sure your whole talent is aligned with whatever. These very generic pieces of advice that you think, yeah, no shit, Shylock, as we say. That I think is one of the problems. But making something really narrowly focused and very practical. Something you can actually look at and say, okay, I can now ingest this and I can make this into a kind of to-do list. Is sometimes missing, and I think it's harder to do. I think there are people who do it really well, and there are individual pieces I would say that have made a fantastic job of giving those actions and making them really specific. But it's not an easy task, and that may be why our clients want it more and we're perhaps not so good at doing it.
Yeah, it also could be an area where AI may help us a bit, right? We can
Yeah.
use AI to find examples with our own repositories of knowledge and so forth. So I'm hopeful on that front, but has always been one of the hardest pieces of any thought leadership publication for us in most instances. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go a little deeper on AI and how that influences the way consumers perceive thought leadership. Talk us through the findings here.
So it's a busy slide, and I won't bother with the whole thing. But broadly on the left-hand side, it's where consumers specifically have, as you can see, are pretty negative about the use of AI in thought leadership. They are negative about the use of synthetic data, and the whole, they don't really like the idea. And I think the reason is because they would perceive it as being a bit close to slop, that if we are just, if we're doing is using a prompt to produce a piece of thought leadership, well, they can do that themselves. So, hey, what's the big deal? So I think some of it is an understanding of how we're using Gen AI. And I think we have a responsibility to make that much clearer than on the whole we are all doing. But when you look on the other side, the green side of the fence, when it comes to things like curation and personalization and finding ways through thought leadership, clients are really embracing AI in a big way. So really keen to see tailored insights, really keen to use AI tools to maybe synthesize content from a number of different organizations. We're coming back again to that problem of brand. It's just not there anymore, because what matters is the actual nugget of what you're saying, not necessarily who said it. And you can see a big difference. Now, this I think is this will be a shifting pattern, because I think as we are much clearer about the positive uses of Gen AI in thought leadership, and I think that's a story that we haven't told very well. We need to tell it better. I think this will shift, but at the moment you can see there is considerable skepticism from clients about using AI in thought leadership.
Uh, yes, ironic comment from David Moyer in the audience that if they get it from someone else, it's slop, but if they do it themselves, it's great. I assume that's the contrast between the third bullet on the left-hand column
Yeah.
um, and the access, etc. on the other side. It's interesting. I do think that will shift, though, to your point, Liz.
I think it'll shift. I think that the reason there is this question of agency. If you feel in control of how you're using a tool, then you're more likely to accept it. If you feel you're being done to and you don't really know how something's, being created, then you're more likely to be skeptical. And I think that's really probably what we're seeing underneath that. But yeah, it's a good point.
You could theoretically verify sources now yourself, etc., even if you're using an LLM tool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what the research suggests about the level of AI disclosure that should become standard practice or best practice for thought leadership producers. What did we learn there?
We really learned was again a disconnect between what our clients expect and what we're actually generally doing. So as you can see here, only 14% of those 350 thought leadership creators always disclose the use of AI or Gen AI in what they're doing. Nearly over half say, "Oh, it's played a major role." We'll say something. I would question that, because I suspect people don't really know what a major role is versus a minor role. I think we wouldn't necessarily agree on that. And a colossal third have no policy at all on disclosure. So I think that's an opportunity for all of us who are in the thought leadership game, is to have very clear policies about, just as we do on the whole with research methodologies, I think we need to be also very, very clear both about legitimate use of Gen AI in thought leadership, and also how we talk about it and disclosing it honestly. On the right-hand side, as you can see, clients expect that. They really expect you to be transparent, particularly in data analysis, in hypothesis and survey development, and pretty much everything except for secondary research. They would expect there to be a transparent disclosure.
And anything deeper on what a useful AI disclosure might look like to an executive reader? Is it just a line, or any thoughts there?
I think this little list on the right is it's a good starting point, which is that we know that we use Gen AI tools across the journey, from hypothesis development right through to the final draft.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think we need to be aware of is, okay, so how did we use it? And why did we use it? I mean, I think it's the why that we miss. So people otherwise think, oh, well, you've just done that because, for example, synthetic data, oh, you've just used synthetic data because it's quick and cheap. Well, no, I mean, there are very many good reasons why you might want to use synthetic data. So I think we have to tell that story better and be very specific.
Mhm.
And this list is a first stab at that, really.
So not just a line at the bottom of a piece that says, but something that's a little more robust and framed. Interesting. Okay, so we will keep moving. Most folks in our webinar audience are likely thought leadership producers. So let's turn to how AI factors into the challenges the folks who sit in our seats have to grapple with. And I thought it was interesting here. The research shows that top among these challenges, Liz, are actually factors that conduce to using AI, funding, headcount, skills. AI provides leverage in all those areas. Are those incentives to using AI?
I certainly think for smaller producers, and as I say, there is pretty big contrast between the larger producers here on the right, where it's mainly, the complexity of governance and difficulties dealing with stakeholders. But I think for smaller producers, budget and things related to budget, like headcount, you're absolutely right. I mean, AI tools now really make so much of that available to even if you've got quite small budgets. So, there is a low barrier of entry now into the thought leadership world that didn't exist, even 5 years ago. It was a really expensive thing to launch a big survey and do it properly and globally. Now there are ways of asking those questions and answering them in an intelligent way using a fraction of the dollars. And that opens the doors really to far greater number of producers.
Okay, so let's keep moving. I'm a thought leadership producer. I want to use this data to inform how I advance successfully in an AI-enabled content shop. What did the research suggest that I do? What are the imperatives that I need to pursue?
So if we just look at the next slide, um, here we boiled it down to five big things. So the first one, which we've mentioned, is transparency. So be really disclose the use of AI and do it in an intelligent way and explain why it was worth doing. Why did you do it? How did that enhance what we've actually produced? Personalization, I think, is going to grow. Enable tailored insights, enable people to be able to find their own way through something. If you do a big multi-sector piece, but I'm actually only interested in mining because that's where I sit, make sure I can just access the bit that's suitable for me. Make that really easy because AI does that so effectively. Interactivity is again a name of the game. I think everybody's really fed up with very long static PDFs, and they want to have more ability to interact with data sets, to maybe put their own data into a model and see how they turn out. Lots of opportunities for us, I think, to innovate in terms of how we present research in a way that is possible to interact with. Measurement evolution, ROI, all of those things. I mean, I think it's really important now we track influence and business impact. We're not just talking about clicks and volume, and we actually need to be more sophisticated. And sometimes with some of the pieces that we do, we're talking to a very small, physically small number of very big influential firms. And how do we track that influence? How do we measure whether we've done a good job? How do we look at that? So that I think, again, AI can help us with. And finally, the good old human in the loop, making sure that we don't do that cognitive atrophy, that we're always there and present, and we're not replacing our own expertise, our own critical thinking with AI tools, but we're using it to help us do it better. And I think it's a good list of five things to do.
Excellent. Okay, there is an interesting question in the chat that I would like to get to from Lisa Holton. If executives are leaning more on AI summaries for immediate or in-depth queries, How should editorial teams and their IT and data partners respond to that? For instance, will existing thought leadership delivery systems like subscription newsletters and strong content archives remain as important? In short, how will we meet our readers? It's a good question.
A really good question. And in fact, those of you, anybody who was at last year's symposium, GTLI symposium in Houston, we had an interesting presentation on how discoverability is changing from SEO to GEO. And there are some, I think, some reasons to be cheerful. One of them is that actually these AI tools, discoverability tools, are seeking out slop and AI content. I mean, it's really interesting. So actually, if you've done a good job, you are more likely to be discovered than if it's machine produced. And there are various ways in which these tools do it. In terms of being discovered, I mean, there are tricks to do, definitely. And a lot of it has to do with quality. You know, can you demonstrate quality? Are you cited? Do you cite lots of sources that are recognized credible sources? And are you cited by any credible sources? Those things will push you up any kind of AI discoverability. In terms of other things like subscriptions, I think the advantage of those really is that you can know your audience. You really know who your subscriber base is, and therefore you can personalize the content more accurately. So I think that's a good thing. But this, if you like, the kind of Google universe is really changing. And I think, the channels we use is changing. Suddenly, for example, specialist industry titles that we probably 3 years ago wouldn't have cared about suddenly become important because they're considered to be a credible source for particular things. So that question of niche and depth, as opposed to shallow broad, is something that I think is going to be increasingly important. And we have to demonstrate that if we want to be discovered.
Okay. Okay, we are unfortunately at or a little over time. Liz, thanks so much for joining us today. Did you want to say one thing on this slide here? I
Just to
neglected.
say it's worth getting right. For me,
Yeah.
the point of this slide is to say it's not easy, but when you get it right, look at the commercial benefits that will accrue to your own organization. So I would say never forget this is actually impacting people's buying decisions. Yeah.
Liz Bolshaw, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a massive pleasure. Thank you so much, Lucia, and everybody else who joined.
And again, for the longer version of this research and for more about upcoming events hosted by the GTLI, including future webinars, visit our website at www.gtli.org. You can also look there for some guidelines we're in the process of developing on responsible use of AI, so that's a work in progress, but check there for more. And you can subscribe to our weekly GTLI newsletter for highlights of the best thought leadership of the moment, which is particularly interesting during these volatile and fast-moving times. And of course, follow us on LinkedIn. Have a great day or evening and be well.